The city was still wiping sleep from its eyes when the first rays of sun crept over the skyline. In the heart of downtown, where the rich started their days with overpriced coffee and meetings in towering buildings, a girl stood silently across the street from the Ritz Monarch Hotel. Her name was Aaliyah. She wasn't homeless, not in her heart, but life had certainly tried to make her feel that way. Wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen too many winters, her hands trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from the weight of hunger, pride, and hope. She wasn't there to beg. She had rehearsed her line carefully, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Not out of desperation, but dignity. Not for herself, but for her younger brother, Samir, who was still asleep on a park bench 2 blocks away. That line was her shield and her sword. A meeting meant to change everything. Across the polished pavement, Richard Caldwell III adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Italian suit. The hotel concierge greeted him like royalty. A billionaire many times over, Richard had long stopped noticing the people outside his bubble of wealth, until today. Something about that girl made him pause mid-step. It wasn't the clothes or the pale face, it was the fire still alive in her eyes, refusing to be extinguished. She looked directly at him, as though she saw past the silk and the silver watch. He turned slightly, and for reasons he couldn't explain, his usual cold stride hesitated. That hesitation would change everything. She stepped forward. "Sir," her voice was soft, unsure, but not weak. "May I have your leftovers?" Richard blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. No one had ever asked him that. Not like this. It wasn't pity she asked for, it was a chance. His first instinct was to nod politely and move on, but his heart betrayed him. There was something raw and painfully real in her voice that cut through the noise of his sterile, gold-plated world. Without thinking, he held the box of croissants forward. "Why don't you join me instead?" he said. The look on her face wasn't just surprise. It was the recognition of a door being opened, one she thought had been permanently locked. They sat at a quiet table in a corner of the hotel restaurant. Waiters whispered, eyebrows raised. The regulars watched curiously. But Aaliyah sat tall, though her hands shook as she picked up the cutlery. Richard, too, felt oddly nervous, like a man on his first job interview. They spoke in fragments at first, about the city, the cold, the absurd price of jam. She laughed, and he found it disarming. She told him about Samir. How she lost her job when the garment factory shut down. How they lost their home when their mother died. And yet, her story wasn't a plea for sympathy, it was a portrait of resilience. It shook Richard in places long dormant. One breakfast turned into 2. Then 3. Soon, it was routine. He brought her books sometimes. She brought stories. He offered her a coat. She declined but accepted a scarf. Each day, Richard found himself anticipating their talks. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a tycoon but as a man. She, in turn, saw in him not a savior, but someone who still had the power to be human. He began asking questions about homelessness, youth programs, job aid, topics that never made it to his conference calls. And she, cautiously, began to dream again. A forgotten place with new light. One day, he invited her to visit an old community center his company had once donated to but left abandoned. It stood like a skeleton of good intentions, hollowed out by time. She walked through its empty halls, touching the dusty chalkboards, imagining children singing or learning math. "This place could mean something," she whispered. "If you let it." Her words echoed like prophecy. Richard hadn't seen potential in a building for years, only in quarterly profits. But now, this young woman, once starving on a sidewalk, was showing him the blueprint of legacy. A fire ignited. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He remembered her words, her hands brushing the wall where a mural once hung. He looked out over the city skyline and realized he had built towers, but no roots. The next morning, he made phone calls. Not to investors, but to local teachers, social workers, construction teams. He pledged millions not to build something new, but to rebuild what was nearly forgotten. And at the center of it all, he placed Aaliyah. Not as a token, but as a leader. The grand reopening was humble, filled with laughter and the smell of food instead of luxury perfume. Aaliyah, now in a clean dress and steady shoes, was asked to speak. She stood on the small stage, clutching the same paper she used to carry her coffee in. "A year ago, I asked for leftovers," she began. "Not for charity, but for hope. I thought I'd be ignored. But someone looked into my eyes and saw more. And that changed everything." Tears flowed in the audience. Richard stood at the back, hands clasped, his heart full. The center now bustled with life, children reading, mothers learning new skills, fathers finding work. Aaliyah studied social work and led evening classes. Samir excelled in school. Richard visited every week. He no longer felt like a benefactor, but like family. Reporters tried to frame the story as a billionaire saves homeless girl. But those who were there knew better. It was kindness meeting courage. It was the rich learning how to give deeply, and the struggling learning how to rise. Years later, a bronze plaque stood near the front entrance of the center. It read, "It began with leftovers, but became a lifetime of change." Tourists passed by, parents pointed at it, children ran beneath it. And every now and then, Aaliyah would return to that very hotel sidewalk, not in rags, but as a reminder. Because miracles don't always arrive with trumpets and lights. Sometimes, they whisper through a single act of compassion. And in a world that often forgets, this story remembers, that a simple question, spoken with quiet hope, can be the spark that lights up 1,000 lives.